This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Body Count, a history podcast where we gab about death and disaster through the ages, highlighting figures, single events, time periods, whatever it may be that resulted in someone, or as is usually the case, a lot of someone's dying. If you're okay with all of that, I am your host, Jessica Manor, joined as always by my favorite little peppercini in the world.
Ah, that's right. My nickname, Cara DiDemuzio, aka Jessica's Peppercini, apparently.
And she is the perfect side dish to my Mediterranean salad, let me tell you.
Well, Jessica, guess who's back?
Back again.
Shady's
back.
You hit that right where
Tell
I wanted to
friend.
go. I was about to go there, and you just did it. I guess we're in sync.
Hey, I don't know any in sync songs, so
the only one I know is "Bye Bye Bye," but we can't do that in the beginning, or it'll confuse our listeners. So,
oh yes, yeah, we'll have to do it at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Or "Cry Me a River," which, by the way, listeners, is a spoiler alert for what Thomas actually does want us to do today. So
yeah. I'm gonna make you cry because I'm back to talk about hopefully you've listened to the other, I think it's like 5 or 6 episodes we've done prior to this.
Yeah, at this point, y'all, if you're starting in on this one, rewind if you haven't.
Why did you see a thing that says Gallipoli episode 6 and go, yeah, I want to start with that one?
I'm gonna start right there.
It's the same asshole that flips to the end of the book and just says, I would just want to know where it's going to be at. You know, it's the same asshole.
I don't know why you'd get this far, or why you'd start here and just go, yeah, I just want to start at the end. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. But yes, we're continuing to talk about Gallipoli, and all going well, we'll get to the end. So this will be the last one. So if you've been listening to every single one and going, holy shit, I can't wait for this to be done, don't worry, this will be the last one, hopefully.
Unless Jessica dies.
Especially if you've been binging this and you're like quite emotionally exhausted, which understandable. So we're gonna finish it off today. We're gonna talk about the end of the battle, or the end of the campaign, and how they got out, and kind of what happened to the main characters of that we've been talking about. So people like Hamilton. Godly.
Not that Hamilton. Y'all.
Not that Hamilton.
Again, start out episode 1, folks. I see you listening in.
Yeah.
That haven't.
So yeah, like people like Hamilton, Godley, Birdwood, Johnston, Temperley, who we've kind of briefly mentioned as well. Kind of what happens to them to kind of round it all off.
Oh God. I forgot how invested we are in so many people. Like,
yeah, there's a lot of names.
I'm all tears and fears tonight. Okay, like,
yeah, so there's a lot of people to remember. So we talked about who they all were kind of way back. But hopefully we'll probably maybe put something in the show notes to kind of just give you a brief, like, this is who everyone is. Just in case you're like, holy shit, I don't know who this guy is. So do you guys remember what happened last time? Because I know for listeners it's going to be 30 seconds since they listened to the last one, but it's been a week since you guys listened to the last one.
We are dug in at a very precarious position. We've tunneled between both. We're gonna have some trouble, and we're gonna have a stance that I know is not gonna end well. And we're also wondering where in the fuck the Ottomans are at. We're just about to. We're poised for something horrible. I know that.
Yeah, so what happened last time is the Wellington Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel William Malone, who's the guy we've been following. He led his men up to Chunuk Bair from the Apex, which is part of the Sari Bair range, which is what they're trying to take. And Chunuk Bair is, when they got up there, they were expecting to meet heavy resistance. Because the Aucklands and the Canterburys had basically effectively been wiped out at this point, because they had, in the case of the Aucklands, they had tried to attack the position and had done in broad daylight and been annihilated. And the Canterburys just had a really bad commander, and he just was not very good at positioning his men and got wiped out. And so Malone, with the Wellingtons, crests Chunuk Bair and finds that the Ottomans aren't there. And so they take...
It's a trap.
They take the little kind of hillside with no shots fired, which is really good for them, obviously. And so Malone kind of comes to this crossroads of how does he want to proceed? Does he want to, basically run down the hill and try and capture as much territory as he can, capture as much land as he can? Or does he dig in where he is and try to fortify his position? And he chooses the latter. He chooses to fortify his position because he rightfully knows that if the Turks aren't here, if the Ottomans aren't here, they're somewhere else because they've just walked away, and in all likelihood, they have tactically retreated with the intention of coming back, rather than they've just gone on a full-scale retreat. Because who goes on a full-scale retreat when you're winning, right? So he's like, I'm going to dig in. This is when he's presented with again, a bit of a crossroads, a bit of a, he needs to determine how he's going to fortify this position. And again, he has a couple of options. The one that he lands on is to fortify the main Turkish trench. And then on the other side of the crest, he has his men dig a kind of supplementary trench, which is then connected by a small tunnel through the crest of the hill. And this is something that we'll get into a bit later, but he's quite highly criticized for this decision. And to kind of just give you an idea of where we're at this point, just kind of go back a little bit from what we had last episode. The men that were doing this, the officers were doing it as well. And of course, the officers were generally pretty hands-off at this kind of point in time. They didn't really associate themselves with the rank and file, as it were. But in this particular instance, the officers were picking up entrenching tools as well, and they were digging the supplementary trench and fortifying the main Turkish trench as well, because, as we kind of mentioned last time, their efforts in the next few hours of digging this trench would determine whether many of them lived or died. And they seem to have been extremely aware of that fact. Can
I just say that Facebook video, or not Facebook, sorry, I'm not even on Facebook, that shit you posted on Twitter, you can look at all the maps in the world, and then I actually see and comprehend what they're digging into because of that. That thing on Twitter, it was terrible. Like even more, because I'm 100% into where we're at and the realities of trying to dig a trench in that shit. It's just horrific. I cannot tell you enough, listeners, when you're digging for your literal life and you know it, I can't even imagine how horrible this fucking was. Oh,
digging for your life in something in a substrate that doesn't want to be dug. It's an extremely hard substrate, and you're doing this throughout the night after you've probably got like 6 hours worth of sleep in the last 2 or 3 days. It's not a good time at all. And the only reason that they were able to do this, or a big part of the reason they were able to do this, is because there was currently a fog kind of over Chunuk Bair and over the wider area. So the Turks, wherever they were, couldn't actually see them. So they weren't actually being fired upon, even though they were quite out in the open. So that worked in their advantage. However, at some point the next day, the fog did lift. And the British soldiers that were now... so the British soldiers that were still crossing from the apex and many men on the crest between the two trenches came under heavy machine gun fire from the Turks who were at Hill Q. So if anyone needs to check the map, that's where they were firing from. The Welsh pioneers losing most of their officers and men before even reaching the Wellington position at 8 a.m. Again, this is in, I believe, about mid to late August. I can't quite remember the actual date. But yeah. So a huge wave of Turks then come out, and they're all yelling Allah and that sort of thing at the same time, now attacked the main trench, which was manned by the Gloucestershires, who basically immediately broke and fell back to the Wellington line, causing a small panic in Malone's men, as well as having to now compensate for their exposed right flank. As their trench began to pile up with dead and wounded, the Wellingtons fought intensely for as long as they could until they were overrun and driven back to the support trench on the seaward side. So that's the one that they've just spent basically the entire night constructing and digging out. The first Turks into the forward trench bayoneted the wounded or simply just beat them to death with the butts of their rifles. 14 others were taken captive. By now, the Auckland Mounted Battalion and the Māori contingent were sent in to reinforce them. The Māori contingent were driven back by Turkish fire in a valley and had to retreat, whereas the Auckland Mounted took most of the day to get to the Wellingtons, making sure not to repeat the mistake of the Canterburys, who, if you remember, they actually tried to get past this very exposed bit and sent all of their men at once, and they were just gunned down. So they were trying to be a bit more careful about that, so that they didn't lose all their men. Things went from bad to worse as the artillery began to shell the Turkish line. And if you've been concentrating for the last 2 minutes, the Turkish line is on the Anzac line. So,
Oh no,
quote,
they're getting their own people.
yeah. Quote, they did more damage to us in half an hour than the Turks did all day. They killed two
That's a
trenches
disaster.
of our chaps, end quote.
Can you imagine getting killed by friendly fire, like in any given conflict? That's the worst.
I want you to hold on to that thought. At 3 p.m., Malone sent one of his officers to brigade HQ on the Apex. Sorry, so he sent one of his officers to where Godley and Johnston, I think actually might have been Johnston, was hanging out on the Apex with an urgent request for more reinforcements and to stop shelling the crest as it was killing his own men.
Ooh.
Johnston and Temperley, if you remember, Temperley is the kind of right-hand man of Johnston, found it hard to believe that 3 battalions had almost been wiped out on Chunuk Bair and that the position was now in critical danger of being lost, which it was. And this Chunuk Bair is like a pretty key position in this entire wider battle of Sari Bair.
And Johnson has a bit of a drinky problem, right?
Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
He's probably drunk as this is going on.
Jesus.
So in the end, after I assume much convincing, they did decide to send reinforcements at dusk and to divert the artillery fire further inland. And so now Godley had been brought up to speed and he revised the plan to capture Sari Bair. The attack on Hill 971, where the Indians were currently dug in, was to be abandoned. The Aussies were to re-engage on Hill Q, and another brigade was to occupy the northern crest of Chunuk Bair between it and Hill Q. Again, refer to the map if you're having a bit of trouble trying to figure out where all that stuff is. The Wellingtons and the Auckland Mounted Rifles on the top of the crest of Chunuk Bair would be reinforced by the Otago's and Wellington Mounted Rifles. In the afternoon, a divisional conference would be held at Brigade HQ to discuss the details of this change. So they decided they'd hold a meeting to, get down to the nitty-gritty of who'd be doing what, how it was all going to work, and all that kind of stuff. Godley, nor any of his staff, bothered to show up, leaving the key decisions in the hands of Johnston, the alcoholic.
Oh, that.
Who is very much a company man, if you will.
Yeah. And it's just not super great. So he's the highest ranking officer there, so the decisions come down to him. Meanwhile, as this is kind of happening, the Kiwis on the crest are fighting for their lives in the intense heat and dust with a lack of water. Any flags that had been placed on the crest to signal their position to the Navy were now destroyed. So that was so that the Navy knew where they were and not to shell them. Didn't matter anymore. And the dead were everywhere. Now that the Wellingtons were on the rear slope, the Turks could creep up close to the crest and be within 20 meters of the trench, shooting basically at point-blank range, and easily get their bombs into the trench. So bombs being grenades. Any men too wounded to hold a rifle would load those for those that could. Others crawled around, filling their hats with cartridges from their dead friends' pouches and taking water from their water bottles. And this, I really want to stress that this fight at this point wasn't about holding the line anymore. This was very much about whether they were going to get home again. They were literally fighting for their lives. If the Turks overran this position, they were fucked, basically. So it's it's getting wild. It's getting intense. So
Okay.
five times the Ottomans charged the line with bayonets and bombs, and each time the Wellington Battalion pushed them back, the dead piling up in the ravine behind them. One soldier lamenting that there was 200 of them that had died or were wounded, and that there was nothing anyone could do for them because they were too busy trying to not die themselves. Quote, no water and no attention, and nobody could do anything. We were being shelled too as we lay there. Men were all smashed up and getting smashed up even more. They knew that they were dying, end quote. In the late afternoon, the Turks had a go at shelling the Anzac position for over 2 hours. Thankfully, by now, a telephone link had been set up so Malone could talk directly to Brigade HQ at the Apex. He didn't have to send a runner.
Thank God.
He told
I
them
wouldn't
that...
have wanted that job.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wouldn't have wanted to listen to him either, because I bet
would have
he's in a fucking fine fury.
Yeah. So he told Brigade HQ that his men were hard-pressed and in dire need of more ammo, bombs, tools, and water, and just basically anything. But despite everything, it seemed Malone hadn't given up yet. And it wasn't like Malone was sitting in the back ordering his men to do the hard work. He wasn't just yelling at them and, basically doing nothing.
That's not his style.
As we've established, he's not the type.
He's not the type, exactly. So every time the Turks threatened to break through, Malone rushed forward with his men, sometimes armed only with an entrenching tool, which is basically a really small pickaxe. And he personally led the attack against 2 Turkish charges and was constantly roaming the forward and rear trench, encouraging his men despite heavy Turkish fire. Again and again, each time the Turks charged, Malone was up with a rifle and bayonet to lead the countercharge. Someone saying, quote, he kept boosting our morale and he always had a kind word, an encouraging word. It'll ease off shortly, he promised. They'll get tired of this, end quote.
Fuck you.
So even despite all that, he is in the thick of it. He is literally bleeding with his men trying to push them back. Again, they're all well aware of what happens if they don't manage to hold them where they are. So Malone's second in command tried to get him to take more care and let the officers and men do, the actual fighting work, but Malone refused. It almost seemed like he was invincible, with his rifle being shot out of his hand, but Malone himself remaining unharmed. That was until 5 p.m. The shelling seemed...
No. Oh,
that was
okay.
That was at until 5 p.m. the shelling seemed to stop. Malone and Major Schofield of the Auckland Mounted prepared to settle their troops in for the night into better defensive positions. Just as they stood up after their discussion to get cracking, a shrapnel shell burst over the HQ trench that they were in. Colonel Jordan of the took one to the mouth, Schofield a fatal one through the lung, and Lieutenant Colonel William George Malone, commander of the Wellington Battalion, was hit twice in the head and collapsed into the second man's arms, dead. He was 56.
That far? Like, that far and like that.
Remember how I told you to hold that thought, Kara?
You fuck off. No.
This
Okay.
shell was likely from a British warship or a New Zealand field artillery.
Oh, for fuck's sake. That's like a new definition of being your own worst enemy, is it not? Like, oh my God.
And so that's how it goes out.
And I mean, I think Malone kind of knew he wasn't coming out of there, though.
Yeah, as we kind of talked about in one of the earlier episodes.
He was realistic.
Yeah, he kind of had this weird kind of notion that he wasn't coming back. He knew that he wasn't coming back in a weird way that sometimes people know those things. And I mean, he's just statistically, he wasn't.
I was going to say, maybe he's the large numbers kind of guy, but also like, fuck. And that's so much worse because I can imagine him being that just, over and over. Sometimes you need to hear, even if you know it's not gonna stop, that it's gonna stop. Like, oh fuck, it's gonna get so much worse. I know it's gonna get so much worse. I'm already leaking a little bit, which is apparently what I'm gonna term crying tonight. I'm sorry.
No,
It's
that,
late. I'm
you honestly
leaking.
are you a vegetable? Are you a leek tonight, Jessica?
Yeah, apparently so. Apparently so, Kara.
I guess
I'm
Thomas
leaking.
is cutting onions while he's podcasting.
I am Lewis Leaky. Okay, like, all right, it is what it is.
But
I didn't think I'd cry this early.
all of your
If
commands.
that's positive.
Can you imagine the soldiers like witnessing this? I'm just saying, like, that's pretty traumatizing.
Yeah, it was. By the sounds of it, it was quite a morale blow to the Wellingtons.
Yeah, you just had your dude
general.
that like led you through thick and through thin, like through the worst of it, like the person that kept you training.
But also, in that same turn, I might get in a real bad mood really, really fucking quickly. Like, Jesus Christ, I've had enough.
Jessica, like, you would be the one that got super, like, freaking robot mode. Like, I don't even know how to explain it, but just jumps into the line of fire, just going fucking Rambo on shit inexplicably. No, but I see what you mean, because I feel like, especially because he had like this close influence on his guys, I could see where it would go like in a way where it'd piss them off, you know? But they also weren't in a position where they had any kind of ground at that
Exactly.
point.
Yeah, it was, and as we'll mention in a minute, that they didn't have the ability to really do anything about it.
That's always worse too, when you want to do something and you just can't.
Yeah, so the capture of Chanakbea by the Wellingtons on the 8th of August was really the climax of basically the entire Gallipoli campaign. By the time Malone was killed at 5 p.m., fewer than 100 Wellingtons, a couple of units of Mountads, and the odd Gloucestershire and Welsh pioneer held the ridge. Keeping in mind that a full battalion, of which the Wellingtons were, would typically consist of roughly about 2,000 men. So they were down to about 100, or less than 100. They were hungry, thirsty, and absolutely exhausted from 10 hours of nearly non-stop heavy fighting. That night, the Otargos and some Wellington Mountads relieved those still defending Chanakbea. And if you remember from a few episodes ago, Malone's eldest son, Edmund, was part of the Wellington Mountads. So he may well have been among them to relieve the Wellingtons on Chanakbea. However, it is not recorded if he found his father's body or even knew of his death at the time. Of the 760 Wellingtons who assaulted Chanakbea and captured it with relative ease, only 70 unwounded men walked off it. So that's whatever the maths is on that, that's like probably an 80 to 90% casualty rate, which is just horrific. With ragged, tattered uniforms, some of them had not slept in 2 days and had not had water for more than 12 hours. Through the next day, the Otargos and Wellington Mounted were smashed by relentless attacks from the Turks, possibly suffering, quote, an ordeal even more intense and dreadful than Malone's men had endured. Bombed, shelled, sniped, raked with machine gun fire, suffering extremely from thirst, they utterly refused to be dislodged, and all day the sun blazed down on their agony, end quote. So they were getting it just as bad, nearly, or even worse, potentially, than what the Wellingtons had just gotten. So for all that they had suffered, for all that they had been fucked over by their British commanders, it was really at this point that the Anzacs would really not release Chanakbea without making the Ottomans pay in blood and sweat to take back their home. They were really, like this, by the sounds of it, as far as they were concerned, this was it. Like, if they were going out, they were going out with a bang. They were going to make the Ottomans basically take it from their cold, dead fucking hands at this point. In the end, however, on the night of the 9th of August, the Kiwis were relieved by 2 British regiments, which totaled about 1,500 men. Most importantly, these regiments were inexperienced. And at the same time,
oh no.
Yeah, at the same time, Ataturk's battalions were massing behind Sari Bir. They rushed Chanakbir and other positions at dawn, killing thousands with bayonets and overrunning them. 20 lines of 300 men each, so that's 20 times 300, whatever that maths is, 6,000? Yep. So 20 lines of 300 men each swept down Chanakbir towards the apex. These are Ottoman troops that are following the now routed British regiments. And remember, the apex is where Brigade HQ is. Mm-hmm. All Allied troops, British, Indian, and Kiwi, fell back in a panic, with a few hundred British troops running towards the Turks with their hands up in surrender. The scene was chaos, as it seemed like they would be driven into the sea. This is basically the worst nightmare that they were trying to stop pretty much the entire way through the campaign. If you remember back when they were doing the initial landings, this was the thing that they were concerned about. The Turks would basically just overrun them, push them into the sea, and that would be it.
Yep,
and so this is what's happening. Yeah. So Temperley ordered the 10 Kiwi machine guns on Rhododendron Ridge, who overlook the apex, to open fire into the chaos. These 10 machine gun crews, along with a bit of help from artillery and naval shelling, managed to stop the slaughter and hold back the Ottomans. Quote, thousands came down, hundreds went back, end quote. So this was, those 10 machine gun crews are arguably what stopped the entire army being routed, which is just amazing.
That is.
So despite this small victory, if you want to call it that, of stopping a rout of all units at Gallipoli, there remained a stark fact. Chanakbir had been lost, and as such, Hamilton's August offensive had failed. In total, 25,000 men had been committed to the attack, and after suffering 12,000 casualties across 4 days, they had made virtually no ground. In fact, only one group managed to capture their objective and hold it out of the entire August offensive across those 4 days and 12,000 casualties. And that was the Kiwis of Chanakbir, were the only ones that managed to capture their actual objective. Everyone else didn't manage it. The Turks now firmly held the high ground, but despite this, Hamilton thought all was good. Quote, their generals knew they were done unless they could quickly knock us off Chanakbir, so they have done it. Never mind, never say die, end quote. At this point, the Wellingtons, or what remained of them, which was not much, along with 3 other New Zealand battalions, were behind the machine guns on Rhododendron Ridge that had just basically saved them. On the 12th of August, Hamilton ordered Johnston and the New Zealand Infantry Brigade to return to the apex and, quote, hold on forever, end quote. Which, to me, I kind of interpret that as that kind of, I guess that kind of military term of you continue until the failure of your command, which is a very, for those who don't know, that's a very military and kind of polite way of saying you fight until all of you are literally dead. We are not coming for you. That is it. You are to hold that position until you can't do it anymore. You're on your own, basically.
Meanwhile, on the others, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say it's not like can't do it anymore. Like you've given up, you're exhausted. It's like you've given up because you're fucking dead or you're bleeding at the head.
Yeah,
that's brutal.
Meanwhile, I also want to remind everybody on the other side of that in a very Lord of the Rings-esque way. If you want it, come and claim it. Ataturk doesn't give a fuck what he loses. So good fucking luck, because you're not like, good luck. Come on, do it again. Like, I can do this all day is his fucking position of this.
Yeah, absolutely. He is arguably more willing to lose men than the Allied commanders were.
Literally, his whole strategy is pretty much, I don't give 2 tits. Like, if you want it,
throw more men at him.
Yeah, exactly. You better be prepared. because I'm prepared. Are you prepared? He's prepared.
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely. So in the days after his death, many paid their respects to Malone, both commanders and the rank-and-file soldiers.
don't do this to me, Tom. Okay, fine.
Hamilton
Okay.
talked about his, quote, brilliant leadership, a hero killed while leading his men with absolute contempt for danger, end quote. Godley and Birdwood praised his loyalty and leadership as well. Interestingly, none of them made mention of the loss of Chunuk Bair, which they would later blame him for. In fact, Godley would later acknowledge Malone's, quote, magnificent leadership, end quote, on Chunuk Bair, but in the direct aftermath, he had very little of positive note to say about that particular situation. Godley's report to Birdwood on the New Zealand role in the wider Battle of Sari Bair would leave out any controversial material, making the report light on actually really any detail at all, because it was all pretty controversial. The roles of the brigade commanders, Monash, who was the Australian Infantry Brigade, and Johnston, as well as the leader of the Canterbury's, Lieutenant Colonel Hughes, were reported as being quote-unquote valuable, despite being absolute complete fuck-ups. A description of Malone's efforts, that being of the capture and stalwart defence of Chunuk Bair, resulting in the effective destruction of the Wellington Battalion and his own death, but still managing to hold the ridge, was not mentioned. So that entire thing was not mentioned in anyone's reports, really, was basically how well they managed to defend it until they were relieved.
So it sounds like they've got themselves a nice little scapegoat there. A dead man can't defend himself.
Yeah. And in general, the Kiwis would receive very little recognition for their valiant and, I mean, dare I say it, heroic defense of Chunuk Bair, with only 1 Victoria Cross and 2 military crosses being awarded.
Shut the... Oh my God, now I'm in a rage. Now I feel real rage.
If I'm not mistaken, was the one that was given for the Kiwis, I think it was the one that restored the telephone connection.
One of them was, I believe, yes.
Which is, can you imagine? Apparently, he got to live to like another 20 years after that. So, my God, the luck that dude had.
Yeah, absolutely. And Malone would have been entitled to a Victoria Cross, a VC, posthumously. However, this was never mentioned. By contrast, the Aussies received 7 VCs for Lone Pine, one of which, interestingly enough, went to a Kiwi. So that's kind of nice.
That's really sick, yeah.
The Gloucestershires, who were part of the group that broke on Chunuk Bair, also received several awards. That wasn't the end of it, though. Rumours, apparently originating from a signaller in Birdwood's HQ, began to circle amongst the troops that the Kiwis were pushed off Chunuk Bair because they had failed to dig in on the forward slope. Something that was absolutely untrue. The same source also pushed a story that the attack of the Aussie 4th Brigade in the left column had failed because they were effectively pussies and didn't fight it with enough vigour. Again, this was untrue because if you remember, they lost half of their men in the fighting. So they had also fought an extremely tough battle as best as they could. The survivors...
So disrespectful.
Yeah. The survivors on the beach from these units were naturally absolutely fucking livid at hearing this because they knew the real story and blamed Godley and Birdwood for spreading the false information. It does kind of seem that if Godley and Birdwood, it seems a bit murky as to whether they actively encouraged this, but at the bare minimum, they didn't really do anything to stop it. Yeah.
Which is bad. It's bad for morale. It's bad for the fact that you're basically saying, okay, these people's lives didn't matter because they're pussies. And God, that makes me so pissed. Like, all those people sacrificed virtually for an uphill battle.
Well, it goes back to that classist problem and that gentleman's war bullshit. I mean, again,
the human
colonists,
material.
they're that human material. They're not quite as human material as, say, British officers or British men, right? Even though they are effectively, but whoo,
Yep.
the Empire has a lot to answer for. Okay, whatever. That disgusts me. I'm very, very unhappy. But let's go on, because
keep
I'm
going.
sure I'm just gonna get more unhappy, and then I'm gonna cry. So
yeah. So on the 21st of August, Malone was remembered in a service which was attended by those who remained in his battalion. In mid-September, his Wellingtons would be withdrawn to Lemnos to rest and get themselves sorted.
fucking finally.
So they were
okay.
finally removed from Gallipoli. That was after it started in April, May, June, July, August, September. They had at this point spent 5 months in the Gallipoli Peninsula, across Hellas and Gallipoli itself. They weren't the only ones that needed it, though. Each Anzac battalion entered the Gallipoli on the 25th of April with 1,000 men apiece. Actually, so that number I said 2,000 earlier was wrong. It's 1,000. Apologies. So on the 25th of April, they entered with 1,000 men apiece. The strongest of them now had no more than 300 men. They had lost 70%. The best battalion had lost 70% of their
holy
of their men.
shit.
Quote, 5 months of monotonous food and thirst, of constant hammering at the Turk, of constant danger and fatigue had left its mark on the hollow-cheeked, sunken-eyed men of Anzac, end quote. By mid-October, the situation was changing again. All thoughts of further progress being made at Gallipoli were basically thrown out, and Hamilton was replaced as commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force by General Sir Charles Munro. So he was kicked out and recalled back to Britain.
So sad.
Yeah, I mean, we're not really that unhappy about it.
Exactly.
Everything considered. At this point as well, Bulgaria had also aligned itself with the Central Powers, which allowed Germany to directly supply the Ottomans by rail all the way to Istanbul with weapons and ammo. And that was basically what was stopping them at this point from absolutely just smashing the Anzacs and the Allies off the peninsula. It was kind of difficult for them to get all these supplies from Germany because Bulgaria was in the way and at that point was remaining neutral. However, as I mentioned, that has just changed.
Yep.
I want to know what sweetened the pot there,
Yeah. That falls a bit outside of scope for us, but yeah.
I have a book or 3 for you, Kara. I will recommend on foreign diplomacy. I actually do.
I always
Don't
think
worry.
that some of those different countries that aren't like intently studied but were geographically important are interesting because people kind of leave them out of the narrative in both World Wars. So
definitely.
So that being said, it was good though, like to clarify, Thomas, it was a good thing they evacuated when they did, basically.
Yeah, well, yes, because the kind of key thing about this was that this meant that the Allies at Gallipoli could soon be assaulted with fresh artillery batteries from the Germans, which was not good. So the British higher-ups, both military and political, now thought the war would be decided by the Western Front and didn't want to commit any more resources to Gallipoli. So it had basically fallen out of favour. This meant that any potential retreat from the peninsula was becoming more and more paramount, as it would need to be done before the winter cold set in, making supplying the besieged army there difficult. So they were really on quite a strict time limit. Given all this, Munro, who's just been made leader of this entire force, recommended evacuation of Gallipoli as soon as possible, something that Hamilton was very fervently against. In fact, he even told his superiors in London that this would result in a loss of 45% of men, as well as most of the artillery and supplies. This didn't work, though, because Hamilton was about to be overruled. In a surprise and extremely secret visit, Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War of the British Empire, came to Gallipoli. So this was kept extremely under wraps. Not even the actual soldiers themselves knew that he was coming. And they actually, I believe, didn't know who he was initially. Until obviously there was this big fanfare. He's this very important looking man. He's all dressed up and shit. And then I believe they eventually worked it out who he was. But initially they had no idea he was coming. And he was there to assess whether the peninsula really did actually need to be evacuated. And he actually toured the trenches and got a lay of the land of the enemy positions. And after a few days there, he formally ordered the Allies to evacuate off Gallipoli and Hellas. And so that was that decided. This would end up being virtually the only successful military operation of the campaign, which really fucking says something. So, yeah. In early December, all non-essential supplies and men were evacuated and sent off, followed by the evacuation of one regiment or battalion in each brigade at a time to Lemnos. Artillery was loaded on the boats at night. Surplus supplies and ammo were burnt or buried because they didn't want the Ottomans to get wind of the fact that they were trying to get out. So, if they were made any indication that they were trying to make a full-scale retreat, they thought the Ottomans might actually try and attack them when they were, unprepared and that sort of thing. So they did a few different things to try and make it look like everything was fine and that nothing was really any different to the Ottomans. So fires were still burnt in deserted shelters. Booby traps were fixed in various positions along with mines, and self-firing rifles were set up with dripping buckets of water. And I've actually got a picture of this from the Gallipoli exhibit in Te Papa, which I will send to you guys now. There it is. So what you'll see there, it might be a bit difficult to see, but under those sandbags is a rifle that is sticking out. The butt of the rifle is on the left, and the barrel, the muzzle, whatever you want to call it, the shooty bit is on the right. And you can see there's like a tin can connected to a bit of string, which has got another tin can beneath it. Basically, the way that it worked is that tin can at the top would be filled with water, and that water would slowly drip through a hole into the bottom tin can. And so when the bottom one had enough water in it, the whole thing kind of tipped because it got so heavy, and then that would basically pull on the trigger and fire the gun whilst no one was there. Basically, the idea making it look like someone was still actually there trying to fire back at them. They weren't trying to actually kill anyone. They were actually just trying to make it look like someone was there and that everything was fine. So if the Turks did decide to attack during the evacuation, the rear guard keeping them at bay would be cut off by barbed wire and expected to hold them off long enough for everyone else to make it out, which would effectively condemn them to death. Thankfully, for those guys in the rear guard, the operation was a pretty great success. The entire Anzac force of about 130,000 men, 400 artillery, and 14,000 animals, including one tortoise called Peter, were loaded onto ships without any real losses. That is actually true. There was a tortoise called Peter. I believe he was eaten, though, unfortunately, later on.
God! Why? Can you bring me no joy, Thomas? What the fuck? No!
Oh, sorry. No, there was a... Sorry, please hold. I'll just read my notes again.
Please hold.
Please let Peter have made it.
Sorry, no, Peter made it. Sorry.
All right, Peter.
Oh,
So, yeah.
thank God.
Before we get to Peter, though, I will just say, in an almost poetic coincidence, the Wellingtons were among the last to leave Anzac Cove.
Of
Which
course they were.
It's kind of one of those things for me, because it was kind of, undoubtedly Malone would have been pleased with this, first in, last out kind of thing. So I found it quite, I found it quite, kind of poetic in that weird way of he probably would have advocated for his men to stay behind had they been able to let everyone else go to evacuate if that was what needed to be done. But yeah, they brought back a tortoise called Peter. Because tortoises were all over the Gallipoli Peninsula because they're native to the region. And he was given by a soldier to a nurse working in Cairo, who then brought him back to New Zealand, and he lived the life of a family pet until his natural death in 1994.
Oh.
Later, in 1916, a female tortoise would be picked up by another soldier after it was run over by a gun carriage in Greece. They named it Torty because they're unoriginal. And she brought him home to Hawke's Bay, where she still lives. Torty is still alive in Hawke's Bay. I believe she lives in the zoo there, in either Napier or Hastings.
Oh my god!
Oh,
this is the story we need.
This is what I need for all the crying I'm going to do.
So that's a little happy
minute.
story in the whole thing. There 2 tortoises were brought back to New Zealand, one which is still alive, and one which lived a full life and died in 94. Not all tortoises made it through, as I mentioned before. Another that was picked up in Gallipoli was turned into soup by Indian soldiers when his quote-unquote owner wasn't looking. So
that's unfortunate.
That's unfortunate. But the shell was brought back to New Zealand. And tortoise eggs were also used to make omelettes during the Gallipoli campaign as well.
Oh.
You got to do what you got to do, man.
In 2018, they said Torty the tortoise is the oldest survivor of World War One.
Correct. That is the exact article that I read for that fact.
That weirdly has made me kind of leak again. I don't know why.
Because it's just an animal.
Yeah, it's just a nice animal. It's a nice kind of fact. For anyone who's listening that has gone to Te Papa, they do have a picture of Torty, and they talk about Torty in the I believe in the exhibit. It doesn't really quite make it clear that Torty was not from Gallipoli. Because I think it has a picture of the tortoise and then says there's still a World War One veteran living, and it's this tortoise that lives in Hawke's Bay.
It's just confusing. It's without the context.
It's not explicitly that is true. That Torty is from World War One, but it's in an exhibit about Gallipoli. It's not really explicitly explained that Torty is not from Gallipoli, so which I found quite confusing. So in case anyone else has seen this and is a bit confused, Torty is not from Gallipoli. Torty is from World War One, just not Gallipoli specifically. But of course, saying that Peter was from Gallipoli and he died in 94 isn't quite as interesting as saying Torty was brought back from World War One and is still alive. So I can see why they chose that, but it is slightly ambiguous.
So apparently, when she was run over by the carriage, she only lost a couple toes, and they think that at the time in World War One, she was around 100, which puts her now at about 200 years old. I'm telling you, if tortoises could talk, can you imagine the shit they'd say? Especially this one.
Yeah, I really heavily considered going to Hawke's Bay to see if I could find Torty.
Can you please do it?
I will do eventually. I just, between researching this and then now, I haven't been able to get that up there. But it's definitely, there's like a list of places I want to go. Seeing Torty is one of them.
Extraordinary and stupid amount of work that Thomas has done for us, Kara. He didn't quite make it there for a Torty picture.
I'm sorry, guys. I let you down. I didn't get a Torty picture.
You didn't get that damn tortoise, sir.
He'll be visiting soon. Now he'll be understand the full story before he visits Torty.
Exactly. I'll have full background.
And you can greet Torty and say, That's all you have to say to the tortoise. I know.
I know. Yeah. So
I don't know if it's that late or if I'm just amused at the idea of Thomas talking to a tortoise.
It's that late, but also I'm imagining you trying to make eye contact with the tortoise, as ridiculous as that is, and then a wink, just a sly wink at the tortoise.
So that effectively ends the Gallipoli campaign in terms of the actual campaign itself. They have been evacuated, and that is the end of Gallipoli as the campaign. They've now fully evacuated. In the years after the war, soldiers and historians would blame Johnston for stopping the New Zealand Infantry Brigade on Rhododendron Ridge instead of pushing as Birdwood had ordered. And Malone would be blamed for later putting his trenches in the wrong place, resulting in the loss of Chunuk Bair and then the campaign as a whole. So he was kind of blamed for actually the failure of the entire campaign towards the end. The assessment, yeah.
I'm in a great deal of armchair rage right now, listeners.
The assessment of Johnston's decision has somewhat been agreed with as being a tactical blunder, and that he should have pushed forward, and that his hesitation likely cost the lives of the Auckland Battalion, as the Turks had yet to arrive in large numbers. Again, he was possibly drunk when he did this, as it would be later found that he was an alcoholic that was constantly drunk. However, in saying that, they had every reason to believe an attack would fail. It was broad daylight, so their element of surprise was gone. They didn't know how large the Ottoman force was, because they were pretty shit at recon, and they only had they only had 2 of the 4 battalions that they were meant to have. The other 2 were yet to arrive, and the Aussie attack on Hills Q and 971, which was meant to support the Chunuk Bair attack, was yet to begin. So they kind of had every reason not to believe that it was actually going to work. But this singular decision has been debated since it was made up until today, with people on both sides of the argument, but ultimately, we will never know many of the decisions that were made or the thinking of the men who made them in those critical moments on the Apex and Chunuk Bair. It's just one of those things that we'll never know what they were thinking, what information they had available to them, and all that kind of stuff.
But if you want to watch a story and slap fight, this is a good one to jump off on, because you could get some slap fights going. But you're exactly right. We can sit and posthumously say all we want. I think the only thing I would add is reconnaissance is very important. Just FYI, which is completely missing largely from all of this particular campaign. As you will know, as you listen to this, listeners, you're going, wow, in the
important aerial reconnaissance, as well as, I don't know, measuring the land, seeing what the terrain's like, seeing, okay, logistically, what you can and cannot do. Lessons to learn from Gallipoli.
Or maybe just don't pick there. Also, I mean, nothing about this lends itself to an invasion. So, but you know what? We're not going to get into that.
The thing to keep in mind, though, is that they weren't meant to land at Anzac Cove, where they did land. They were meant to land about 3 kilometers to the south. So it was already kind of fucked from the get-go.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things, and it's like, would it have worked had they landed where they were meant to? I mean, we can sit here all day and we can argue, but ultimately we'll never know.
That's exactly, it was fucked from the get-go, and instead of cutting our losses, element of surprise is already lost.
Yeah, absolutely. So Malone's flack for the sighting of the trenches, though, has a bit more of a muddy history. The rumour was started in a report, which was apparently written by Temperley, someone that hated Malone, so he may have taken the chance to lay his dead rival low, and his report of events was accepted by Godley, Birdwood, and Hamilton, and then later historians. Meaning that his version of events became the accepted one, despite the fact much of what he said had actually transpired, which largely involved himself solving Malone's mistakes, could not have happened because he wasn't involved in the battle on the ridge itself. He wasn't present for a lot of what he said actually happened. However, one of Malone's staff, who had seen the events firsthand, wrote to historians in 1927 with a detailed account correcting Temperley's version. The historians, so the historians promised to include it in the official history that was being published in 1931. It was not, and the myth the myth that Malone had fucked up on Chunuk Bair persisted for 50 years. In 1941, a British Army training guide mentioned that in a mountainous area where the enemy's artillery fire is of less importance than good field of fire, trenches should be sited on the forward slope, which is, not what Malone did. It mentioned that the commander of a quote-unquote British battalion at Gallipoli who ignored this and allowed the Turks to overrun them. Quote, unhappily, this commanding officer's military qualities of tenacity were matched only by the tenacity of his ideas. Rigidity of mind made him a slave of a textbook, end quote. It wasn't explicitly said that this was about Malone, but if you kind of knew what you were talking about, you would know that this was about Malone.
Oh yes, Thomas, you've sent me quite down a rage-based research hole here recently. In fact, this is all I've been doing. If it makes you feel any better, is just sort of the ins and out of Gallipoli, specifically to do with Malone, because of how you kind of painted this going in. And I have gone down a real rage cycle, and I'm really excited that our listeners are getting to go down that same one.
Exactly. And this was pretty bloody terrible for Malone, given his experience on Gallipoli, and that his name was more or less being dragged.
Yeah.
For something that he didn't actually do.
His poor family.
That he did do, but wasn't the reason why they lost.
Right.
The actual reason the attack failed was that, quite simply, the plan was too ambitious and didn't take into account the issues with a night attack in rough country, as well as the terrible state the men were in and the inexperience of the British battalions. In essence, the Anzacs had been betrayed by poor judgment and the incompetence of their commanders, namely Godley and Johnston. Especially since Godley hid himself away in his HQ, making Johnston the effective commander of a much larger force than his rank allowed. Which is just, I mean, again, it's not rocket science, that one.
It's just, I encourage everybody to actually look real time at what these men are. One, the timeline they're given to make an impossible attack, because ambitious is too ambitious is absolutely correct. More or less, like, it may help our U.S. listeners if you've ever been to Mesa country in the Southwest, where you've got 1,000-foot like bluffs, trying to negotiate these in the dark on a 2-hour timeline. With no light, no anything, and how impossible it is. And the fact that they even reached the point they were supposed to reach, that they managed to pull it off, is fucking astounding. Like, the
counterpoint to that, though, is, of course, the Ottomans let them. They potentially, had the Ottomans not let them, they potentially would never have made it. So that's kind of the opposite side to that, is the Wellingtons, obviously, fearful credit for being the only battalion to actually complete their objective. But they potentially never would have had the Ottomans decided to basically pull a feint and do a fake retreat and then attack them again. So credit where credit's due, but that potentially wouldn't have happened had the Ottomans done what they did.
That's an excellent point. Shit. Damn.
And so, by contrast, speaking of the Turks, Ataturk was near the front, moving quickly to assess situations and counterattack. He was actively engaging with his men to make sure that everything was going the way he wanted it to go. It wouldn't be until 1965 that Malone would receive final vindication and subsequent reinforcement that he was in the right. Again, though, we could spend a lot of time on these arguments, as they have been constantly debated. And that's without looking at the hypotheticals. How long could have Malone held Chunuk Bair had he been properly supplied? How would Malone have handled the attack had he replaced Johnston? Which, if you remember back a few episodes ago, was something that potentially could have happened. So there's a lot of what ifs in there. If things had gone slightly differently, had Malone gotten what he needed, had people made slightly different decisions, maybe they could have done it. I think ultimately the answer is no. The Ottomans still had largely the upper hand, but you never know. Weirder things have happened.
Yeah, weirder things have happened, and I think again, it's a command switch is what it's going to come down to a lot there, because again, I cannot reiterate, guys, especially with all the like they weren't fucking around on the Ottoman side. Like it was, I just can't tell you the difference in command and the difference in the way that it's approached. And so I think the most interesting what if is if Malone had replaced, like we might have, you know what I'm saying? Like that is what really intrigues me, because if that had actually happened, then you've got a real battle of not just like wills, but wits as well, which is what's going to make it interesting. I think that's the biggest one.
Yeah, I think if any kind of hypothetical at that kind of point in the campaign was going to swing things towards the Allies' side, that was probably going to be one of them. Again, he's still dealing with quite incompetent commanders, higher up and kind of laterally as well. So, I mean, he's still kind of ball and chained there a little bit in quite a large regard. But I think, you give Malone command of a much larger force. Suddenly they might have seen things kind of changing, at least at one particular area of that battle. But you never know.
Because it's an interesting thing, because I think there's going to be a lot of command changes as well. Once below, like whether or not, like once you've already taken that step where he is now. Once you've already taken that crucial step of crossing a really big line, I don't think he's going to hesitate at that point. I mean, he already knows what his fate could or could not be if this goes really, really terribly, or even if it goes well. So I think, that's interesting. I think that's probably the biggest what if that can be. He's an interesting figure.
Yeah, definitely. So along with this to bring this kind of into the wider sort of context, there was a lot of reasons that the Gallipoli campaign failed. The Dardanelles Commission, which was kind of set up to basically figure out why it failed, they found in 1917 that the big one was that the surprise had been lost. The shelling from the Navy early on alerted the Turks that something was coming and allowed them to prepare. Because if you remember all the way back, like 3 or 4 episodes ago, they had been shelling the Turks for a good few weeks before they had actually actually commenced the invasion properly.
You mean the Royal Navy shot their wad all across the Dardanelles and ruined it for everyone? Shocker.
The seamen shot their load.
Carrie, you owe me a Coke.
Other issues also included was that the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force was hastily put together and wasn't organized enough for the campaign or the invasion. Under the field service regulations, Hamilton was entitled to order to get detailed info on the Turkish forces in the area, including where the roads and shore defenses were, the location of fresh water, and detailed maps of the area, and a very carefully worked out plan of attack. So he was actually allowed quite a bit of stuff before he was able to go in. However, he was sent to Gallipoli with a 1905, which is about a 10 years out of date handbook on the Ottoman Empire, an old map, and some notes from the Foreign Office, which is just not enough to conduct a highly complex invasion. Historian John Laffin said about it, quote, "No first-class power except Great Britain would have rushed bald-headed at the Dardanelles and Gallipoli without mounts of reflection and silent preparation by a highly trained general staff composed of the best brains in the army," end quote.
There's never been a truer statement uttered.
Yeah.
There has never been a more true statement made. Fuck. Yes.
I guess I wish there was more accountability for them sacrificing people's lives like that. Like, several people got removed from command, or switched over, but like truly it just seems like they were still in this era where there's not consequence really.
Yeah, that's not something that really comes up, as far as I could tell. Is you really fucked up because you got a bunch of guys of our own guys killed. That never really seems to be a sticking point for anyone, kind of at least immediately post the war. So
I think
yeah,
we established that was never going to be an issue with so much human material literally being in, like, that's the most diplomatic, like, British way of putting it that I've ever heard in my life, and it has stuck with me. That phrasing has literally haunted me since you said it, Thomas. There is just something about it. I literally used it today, just fucking berating the way that the British approach this. But I think I'm going to use that quote tomorrow that you've just given me. I definitely, he's a guy I get behind, and I enjoy his work anyway. But what a concise statement.
yeah,
And
it
a
really
truer word has never been spoken.
It really kind of he's talking about something quite specific there, but it really, the general vibe of the quote really really kind of epitomizes the campaign in its entirety.
Yeah.
Basically. Just the lack of planning, the lack of resources, the lack of virtually anything in the entire campaign. So it's I think it's quite a good quote to kind of really, if you want to talk about Gallipoli in a sentence, that's really what it is.
Yeah, I mean, again, from the beginning it was fucked, but I'm not also sure from the beginning it's not fucked even if you land in the correct zone. You know,
absolutely.
like we said, the Navy had shot their wad, the good old Royal Navy.
Yeah, and there was also many operational issues once the invasion began, some of which we've touched on throughout these episodes. But there were many others going on at higher levels as well, with higher levels of command that we haven't really talked about because we don't want to spend 6 episodes talking about Hamilton the whole time. So
no, and I think it's covered in different podcasts that we've done with different folks. Anyway, I think it exists, and it definitely exists within our lexicon. You can go. No,
we have not talked Hamilton, but I don't really want to talk Hamilton. We talked a little bit like Churchill, Boer War, like predating, all of the timeline we're talking about, which is
not
context.
Recently, but back in the day, we had some. Yeah, back in the day, we had talked a little bit about it, so it's interesting. I mean, we can always get guests on, but I think Thomas has brought us a far more poignant narrative.
Yeah, I agree. I think Thomas has hit the nail on the head.
But he's not done yet.
We're not done yet, so save your praise for the end. We're not done yet.
He wants to earn it.
So it's likely that had the campaign been successful, and I've kind of mentioned this through most of the episodes, is that the ultimate goal of capturing Istanbul would not be reached, as they would have had to trek 240 kilometers, which is about 150 miles, in rough country facing fierce resistance. Additionally, there was no evidence that the Ottoman government would surrender if the city fell. So, the whole campaign was predicated on this idea that had no real basis in fact. Or on top of that, if Bulgaria had, for example, joined the Allied side, there was no indication that they could offer any meaningful help to put pressure on the kind of opposite side of Istanbul as well. Interestingly, though, some thought that victory at Gallipoli and then Istanbul, resulting in supplies sent to Russia, may have averted the collapse of the Russian armies in 1917, and perhaps, and perhaps even stalled the October Revolution. This, however, as you mentioned, seems to be generally dismissed by modern historians. But I thought it was worth mentioning because it sounds fucking insane.
Well, yeah, no, it is, but you're exactly right though, because if we go back to the thinking was at the time. One, that you're going to fucking march to Istanbul, which is laughable. But two, if that occurs, that is going to be, again, we're so worried. Again, it's always back to fucking what about Russia? That is laughable too, but it has to be mentioned because that's the thinking of the time.
Yeah, and that was part of what they were trying to do, was they were trying to get supplies. They were trying to find another supply route to Russia. That was part of what they were trying to do. Of course, they had no idea that the October Revolution or anything like that was going to happen. But yeah, that was part of what they were trying to do, was get supplies to Russia and the Russian army, as well as trying to collapse the Ottoman government.
You're exactly right. Collapse, but also there's this fear of there's a definite chance of destabilization, of course, not in the way that it necessarily shook out in good old Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to Malone, news of his death was naturally quite a big shock to those in both Gallipoli and back in New Zealand, specifically Taranaki, which we, of course, have not talked about in a very long time. So if you remember, Taranaki is where he lived. Officers spoke of his battlefield leadership, impeccable organization, how physically fit he was, and how much he cared for the safety and well-being of his men. The Wellington Battalion chaplain, Father John McMenamin, I think I've pronounced that correctly, wrote, quote, "We loved him, every officer's and man, for himself, for his generous heart, and his never-failing fairness. The news of his death was listened to by his few remaining men with his eyes brimming over with tears. Even now the men cannot speak of him without emotion," end quote.
Oh, okay.
That's poignant.
So Birdwood, who had been in daily contact with Malone when he was commanding Quinn's Post, was the one who eventually wrote to his wife Ida, who, if you remember, Malone made a very kind of sad last letter to her just before the Battle of Saribia started.
Oh, I do remember.
So Birdwood wrote, quote, "I always had complete confidence in him and knew that while he was there, all was going right in his regiment, for there was no detail that escaped his attention. He was the life and soul of his regiment, being idolized by both officers and men," end quote. Which is kind of interesting, considering Birdwood and all these other guys didn't really like each other, or they didn't like Malone. Because Godley also wrote to Ida, despite omitting Malone's death in his official report. So he wrote, quote,
"He better fucking come correct, okay? Because if not, I'm just going to lose
the balls
it. Okay.
on this dude.
The fucking nutsack on this asshole. Okay.
Yeah, so Godley wrote, quote, "He was the most valiant soul I think I have ever known. I would have sooner lost a battalion than him. His loyalty and support to me, both in New Zealand and here, has been unfailing. I have lost one of my best friends," end
That's
quote.
cute, except for
He's
how you
kind of an
treat him in
asshole.
public.
Yeah.
What a doofushes. Fuck. What a
Which,
literal
like, on the one
doofushes
hand,
butt.
on the one hand, I'm like, fuck you, Godley, you, like, two-faced piece of shit. On the other hand, you don't tell his fucking wife, "I thought he was an asshole, and I'm kind of glad he's dead."
Right,
Oh,
like,
that's true, but there had
is
to be some happy medium, right?
gentlemanly. Like, there could have been. I'm glad there
There
wasn't.
could have been a more
like,
honest, like, he served valiantly without the...
Especially what's coming down the pipe and going to be thrown Malone's way for so many years. Like, what a fucking statement from you, sir.
Yeah, it's. I do think that they were being rather truthful when they kind of said, he was very good at his job, and he was kind of the life and soul of of his battalion, all this sort of stuff. But I think that came from a place of he was a very very good tactician and strategist and that kind of stuff. And all the stuff about, like, he was a great guy, I was good mates with him and all this stuff, I don't think that was necessarily true. So, yeah, I feel like there's an element of truth in there, but not as much as they were giving.
But also, it's hard to write, listen, lady, your husband's the most exacting guy I've ever met on the fucking planet, and that's about all I have to say. Like,
I didn't get on with him.
I didn't, exactly.
I didn't get on with him. I kind of thought he was a dick. Good at his job, so it was all right. Like
R.I.P. though, right?
Yeah. So back in New Zealand, tributes from former volunteer force officers, lawyers he had worked with or opposed, local body officials, and others flowed in, praising his accomplishments and the many facets of his life. In particular, the massive contribution he made to Stratford and the wider Taranaki community in its early years. Despite Taranaki being mostly Protestant and as such anti-Catholic, because remember he was very Catholic, he's from Irish. He originally immigrated from England, but he was of Irish descent. And full of people who considered themselves British subjects and thus anti-Irish. Malone and his family seem to have been well liked in the area and been among its stand-up citizens. Malone himself known to be always willing to lend a hand and for his sense of humour. There is actually so much to say about him and what he contributed to Taranaki, as well as how he felt about the Empire, New Zealand, and the people who already called it home, that being Māori as well. But as we've kind of really...
He's a swirl of contradictions.
Yeah, like we have talked about really constantly, he is a complex character with a deep sense of duty to his country and the desire to build something better in a new land, whilst also being pretty racist towards Māori and Asians.
And then turning around and somehow yet being like, but these are the guys that I want behind me, like sniping to get me up the hill. Like, again, swirling bunch of contradictions, this man.
And it's one of those what ifs again, is he's obviously experienced a lot of different people, a lot of different cultures. There's that story about the Indian guy that he kind of shacked up with for a night, and that sort of thing.
That's right.
So it's one of those interesting things that had Malone survived and come back to Aotearoa, would his attitude have changed towards indigenous populations or just other non-Western groups? Probably not. But
I was going to say wishful thinking, but not.
I like to be wishful because again, I think he's one of those guys. Man, they served in this shit with me. Of all of this horse shit. Even then, he's just like, I don't give a shit. Like, by the time it's ended, he weirdly praises, and of course, it's a backhanded compliment because it's from Malone. It's just the way it's going to be. But at the same time, it's not going to, I don't think there's going to be a dramatic shift. I think there is going to be at least some sort of shift there, just because I think he's one of those guys that as long as you serve and as long as you're building toward that same ideology that he's building, there is some shift and there is some difference. But I don't think it's going to be anything beautiful and life-changing either.
Yeah, exactly. But it's one of those interesting what ifs. Would he have changed his attitude, in some way? But as for his wife Ida specifically, when she learned of her husband's death, she was no doubt distraught. Of course, we don't know that, but they were very obviously very keen on each other. So she was undoubtedly quite upset, and she actually wanted her husband's body recovered. Although she hadn't learned of his death by this point, on the 8th of August, a stretcher bearer did actually try to recover Malone's body, but he was killed in the attempt. Ida was also told that the Turks now controlled the summit of Chunuk Bair, making a recovery impossible. Ida, unfortunately, never really recovered from the shock of all this. Her health quickly deteriorated, and she had difficulty handling her children, resulting in 5-year-old Molly being put into the care of a convent, and the 2 boys, Dennis and Barney, being put in boarding school. this was only months after Malone's death, so early 1915. Even though he had left her a sizable allowance for her to live off, Ida would remain in poverty for the next 30 years until her death. This wasn't just due to her fragile state, though. Farm export prices collapsed in the 1920s, and there was some serious mismanagement by the executors of Malone's will, so the money she was meant to receive was actually reduced. As such, she was unable to buy a home in England, where she, if you remember, she had moved to England for the period of the war, and instead basically couch surfed until she was given a small cottage in Surrey for war widows. She never actually returned to New Zealand, and we can only really speculate why. No one actually knows. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be where the family's woes ended. The children were said to be homesick, and the children were said to be homesick, and because they had all received a stain on their reputation due to their father's name being dragged through the mud, as we talked about before. Two of Malone's sons that served in the war, Terry and Maurice, were seriously wounded in Gallipoli and Palestine, respectively. Both returned to New Zealand and were discharged from the army. Edmund, if you remember, was part of the Wellington Mounted Rifles and also served in Gallipoli, won the Military Cross for his actions at Passchendaele, but was later killed during the German Spring Offensive in 1918. As it turns out, war is something that the Malones would keep returning to, with Ida's youngest, Barney, being killed in 1943 in Anzio during the Allied invasion of Italy.
Oh.
And
that's unfortunate. Happened.
And in 2012, Malone's great-great-grandson, Lance Corporal Rory Malone, was killed during the Battle of Baghak in Afghanistan as he was pulling his commanding officer to safety. He was 26.
For fuck's sake. That's not the legacy you want. I mean, yeah, it's heroism. Okay, don't get me wrong. But it's heroism and death, which isn't ideal.
So I don't know if you guys caught that at the end, but he was 26.
He's a baby. That's sad. So I assume he didn't have any, did he have family? Yeah.
He did, yes. His mum, well, at least the article that I read mentions his mum. I don't know about the rest of his family. And this battle was described by Defence Force chiefs at the time as the largest battle New Zealand soldiers had been involved in since Vietnam. And I think as much as this is really unfortunate and sad and really awful, I do think that Malone would have been proud of them all for doing what they saw as their duty. I do think that this was really his kind of bag, effectively.
Yeah, they're a ballsy bunch, just like him.
Yeah. As for the rest of the surviving children, life was never really the same. The large house in Stratford was sold off, and with that, the Malones effectively disappeared from the Taranaki spotlight. But what happened to the rest of the commanders? We've talked a lot about these quite colourful characters, these really interesting commanders who are basically fucked up at every turn. What actually ends up happening to them after the war? Well, Hamilton's leadership of the MEF was the last military command of his career. In his retirement, he became the president of a type of kind of returned services association, which I don't know if you guys have that there, if that's a thing over there. I don't know if it's like a British thing, because we've got them over here, but I don't know if you guys have them over there.
The only thing I can think of is we have the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, but
yeah, I guess it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, because it's designed especially more for older folks. Because my grandpa, was a member of a local chapter of it, and he served over in Germany during the Korean War. I guess that's a somewhat U.S. equivalent, semi.
Yeah, roughly. But it's basically a sort of kind of boys' club for
Yes.
veterans. Is effectively what it is.
Exactly. Similar to the American Foreign Legion as well.
Yeah.
Which is another kind of boys' club, if you will. I think they've expanded out to include women, of course, but typically a boys' club though.
So Hamilton rose to become president of this sort of organization. And interestingly, he was an early admirer of Hitler when he rose to power. So there's that.
That's a bad legacy.
Yeah, but he, in the kind of 20 years after kind of Gallipoli and World War One, he didn't really do much that was really of note, and so he died in London in 1947, aged 94. For Birdwood, who, if you remember, he was the commander of the Anzacs overall, he actually followed the Anzacs' return to Egypt, which is where they went after Gallipoli. They evacuated from Gallipoli, where they reorganized and reinforced into two separate units. Birdwood took command of the first unit, and it was sent to the Western Front and fought in the Battle of the Somme. So, yeah.
That's another bloody... Wow. Oh, I did do a little bit of researching, Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
William Malone does have other... So, his... the Rory, his descendant that died in Afghanistan, he did have other brothers surviving because his mom mentioned that it was a loss. So at least we know it wasn't like an only child situation, because that would be particularly horrific. But apparently they do some sort of anniversary of his death. They do like a committee to celebrate, which is wholesome, like to honor his memory. Which that's wholesome. And again, I think, like you said, though, like I think Malone would be pleased in a way, not that obviously his descendants would die young, but that, you know what I mean, they had such honorable ways, if you will, to go out doing their duty.
Yeah, definitely. So
Jessica,
Birdwood...
are you crying again?
Not yet, but a little bit. I'm leaking.
You're leaking.
We got one more. We got one more cry that I'm definitely going to hit you with one more. I know I am.
You're sadist.
Yeah. Birdwood took it was called Anzac One, I believe it was, to the Battle of the Somme. And at the time, he advocated for a Dominion army made up of Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians under his own command. But for a whole bunch of different reasons, that didn't end up happening. He was eventually promoted to the full rank of general in October 1917, taking command of the Australia Corps before being appointed aide-de-camp general to the King in November. He was later given command of the British Fifth Army in 1918, in May, liberating the cities of Lille and Tournai. After the war in 1920, he toured Australia with quite some amount of fanfare before going to command an army in India. He was then promoted to Field Marshal of the British and Australian armies in 1925 and went on to become Governor General of India and Commander-in-Chief of India in the same year. After leaving military service in 1930, he tried to become Governor General of Australia with the backing of the King and the British government. However, the Australian Prime Minister at the time opposed this, and he was instead appointed to a much more minor office. After doing some writing for a rural magazine, he returned to Gallipoli in 1936 to visit the war memorials. He fully retired in 1938 and became a baron in that same year, and he also wrote an autobiography called Khaki and Gown in 1941 and another called In My Time, Recollections and Anecdotes in 1946. He would later die in Hampton Court Palace in London in 1951 at the age of 55. Yeah, very bougie.
Not a ripe old age, though. I will say that.
Yeah. he is actually buried in Twickenham Cemetery, which is also in London. And the kind of interesting part about this is the Australian government still pays for the upkeep of his grave to this day. So he has this really big connection with Australia for some reason. So, there's that. Godley would also follow the Anzacs to Egypt, where he would eventually take command of the 2nd Anzac unit. So again, they were split into 2 units. Birdwood took one, Godley took the other. This unit headed to France a little time after Birdwood's unit. He would be engaged in smaller battles on the Western Front, such as the Battle of Messines, which he performed well in, but the New Zealand Expeditionary Force still really didn't think highly of him. His reputation in the NZEF had really fucking tanked after Gallipoli. And Godley and his unit also played a key role in the Battle of Passchendaele, but Godley himself made a lot of similar errors that he made in Gallipoli, resulting in a heavy loss of life, which he, again, downplayed in his reports. During this time, he was constantly under fire from the New Zealand Defence Minister, who was concerned that Australia and Canada weren't giving the same amount of men and supplies as New Zealand. The minister also started to question the quality of British generalship. So even back home, they were questioning whether British command was actually the right way to go. And this actually nearly resulted in Godley's sacking, but it never ended up happening. He did retain his command.
Naturally.
Yeah. So his Anzac unit was later cannibalized until, not literally cannibalized, what I mean is it was stripped and taken to various things before anyone panics too much. So it was stripped and put into other units until it was made up of British units during the German Spring Offensive in 1918. He was awarded various honours by the French, Serbs, and Belgians at the end of the war. After the war, he took command of a British Army Corps in occupied Germany, while still remaining in an admin capacity for the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. In 1920, he became the military secretary to the Secretary of State of War for a couple of years before returning to Germany to become commander-in-chief of the British Army there. The British Army of the Rhine. He was promoted to general in 1923 before taking the English Southern Command, which is basically like a home defence command. In 1928, he was made governor of Gibraltar, which he remained in until his retirement in 1933, making tours of New Zealand in 1934 and 1935. He apparently held his New Zealand soldiers in such high esteem that he included the image of a New Zealand infantryman on his coat of arms when he joined a chivalric order in 1928, because for some fucking reason they were still doing those in 1928. We're still doing them now, but yeah, so he included that in his coat of arms. In 1936, he nearly became governor of New South Wales in Australia, but he didn't make it. He did write some memoirs about his life.
What a shame.
What a shame. So he wrote some memoirs about his life in 1939, titled Life of an Irish Soldier, among other articles. Another book he wrote was called British Military History in South America, for some fucking reason. In 1936, his wife died in New Zealand, where she had remained since he came here. He came to New Zealand initially, which is a bit strange. Because he seems to have remained outside of New Zealand for a lot of his life after the war. The New Zealand government sent a wreath on behalf of the country. At the age of 72, after the outbreak of World War II, he offered his services to the New Zealand government, but he received no response. He was later given command.
Ghosted.
Absolutely fucking ghosted. He was later given command of a platoon of Home Guard in Britain. He would fully retire in Berkshire not long after that. Godley died in a rest home in Oxford in 1957 at the age of 90. Johnston,
Damn.
our drunk man Johnston, was in poor health for most of the Gallipoli campaign. Fucking shocker. And this continued afterwards as well, putting him in and out of hospital. After the reorganization of the Anzacs in Egypt, Johnston's brigade was named the 1st Infantry Brigade, one of the 3 brigades in the New Zealand Division. This was placed in Birdwood's unit of the Anzacs and went to the Western Front. And if you remember, this was the one that went to the Battle of the Somme. So Johnston was involved in the Battle of the Somme. In poor health, he went to Britain in December 1916 for treatment and was diagnosed with neurasthenia. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. Which is a not well-defined illness, but it caused fatigue, headaches, irritability, and is mostly associated with, quote, emotional disturbance, end quote, which is all not things you want associated with a military commander. Despite this, he took command of an infantry brigade camp called Sling Camp near Bulford in England, which, if you know anything about, or you really know your New Zealand military history, this is where New Zealand soldiers quite famously carved a giant kiwi on the hillside because they were really fucking bored. And the commanders needed to give them something to occupy themselves with.
My God.
So if you go to Bulford in England today, there is actually a giant kiwi with the initials NZ on the side of the hill, where they built this giant kiwi on the hillside because they needed something to do. So it's still there. Where am I at? Here we are. Johnston would return to the Western Front in July 1917, but was killed 2 months later by sniper fire at the age of 45. So, as for Malone and his son, Edmund, they are both commemorated in Stratford's Hall of Remembrance, which has pictures of those from the area who died in World War I, which, again, I don't know if that's a common thing in America, but it's a very common thing here in New Zealand is war memorials with people's names from the area, particularly in small towns and that sort of stuff. In 1923, the Malone Memorial Gates were erected at the entrance of King Edward Park in Stratford, being paid for by the officers of the Wellington Regiment of the New Zealand Army, who now commemorate Chinook Bear Day annually.
Oh, okay. Woo! Okay.
In 1991, a large concerted effort was made to restore Malone's reputation and acknowledge his immense role at Gallipoli. This resulted in the Exceptional Services Honours Bill that was introduced to Parliament, as the government wasn't able to reward him with anything posthumously. This bill would allow them to do that to Kiwis who had given outstanding service to their country but weren't recognised when they were living. Unfortunately, this bill didn't pass the Select Committee stage, and neither did a similar bill in 1997. So,
Can you propose this?
I mean, I wish I could, but...
Guess we got it. Okay, we have to campaign for Thomas to be an MP.
Wow, that's...
Yeah, because they're going to give two tits about two.
Hey, he's already been in there.
Yeah, hey, New Zealand Green Party, call me.
Right?
Shoot your shot.
Thankfully, that wasn't quite the end of it, though. In August 2005, Prime Minister at the time, Helen Clark, unveiled the William G. Malone commemorative plaque in the Grand Hall of the Parliament buildings. And in 2010, the Stratford District Council erected a statue of Malone in the town's main street. And if you follow me on social media, I have seen that statue. That is something I have been to, and I have taken a picture of it. So I haven't
we'll
quite...
forgive you the tortoise, then.
So I was actually, interesting enough, when I was researching this, my job actually said, hey, do you want to go up to Taranaki and do some stuff up there? And I was like, oh yeah. And when I was planning out the route that we were going to take, I realized I had to go through Stratford. And I was like, oh my God, I can go see the statue. Yes. So
I
went and saw the statue. Nicely. So that was really nice. So that was really cool. When I was actually deep in the goo of researching this, I got to go see his statue, which was really, really, really cool. So, yeah, so I have actually seen that.
There we go, everybody. Now I'm officially crying.
We're not done yet.
Leaking.
I'm not done yet.
Oh, fuck you. You're just going to wreck me, aren't you? Go ahead.
Because
ahead.
I have a bit of a reputation of I don't know if you guys won't have seen or heard the uncut version of my Bob Semple with Caden from Happy Hour History, but I went on probably what was like approximately a 20-minute patriotic rant about New Zealand. So I've got a script this time to keep me on track. But just as kind of some kind of thoughts kind of at the end. Malone was arguably one of the best minds in the Gallipoli campaign. He had spent years studying various military leaders and wars throughout history, absorbing everything they had to say and then putting it to practical use in the field. He knew that surprise and good recon were two key elements in any battle, something that his superiors seemed to barely grasp. 20 years after the campaign, the official historian of Gallipoli praised Malone's plan that he devised in May when he was in Hellers to break out from Anzac and across Sari Bair, saying, quote, "It was an extraordinarily astute appreciation to have made so early in the campaign, and he was dead right," end quote. Which, of course, his plan was the one that was more or less what they tried to do with the Battle of Sari Bair. It's just, that's the kind of incompetence of the British generals didn't really, kind of got that all stuffed up. The core elements of Malone's plan were reflected in the eventual August offensive, as I mentioned. On top of this, his big brain was the fact that he made sure his men were well prepared. Endless lectures, tactical exercises, drills, marching in the Egyptian heat in fields. Malone trained and pushed his Wellingtons harder than any other Anzac unit, resulting in most of the soldiers hating him. Then, of course, there was the amazing organizational skills in making sure that his positions were clean and tidy, making his men even more efficient. Even though he was absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, fucking batshit insane, absolutely no one could say that his crazy training regimes hadn't made his men ready for what the Turks would throw at them. And they did throw everything they had. It's important to keep in mind, as we have mentioned, that we were the invaders. The Kiwis, the Anzacs, the British, the Allies in general were the invaders. The Ottomans that were defending Gallipoli were only doing what anyone would do when an invading army lands on these shores, which I think, as Hamilton quite eloquently put, hold on forever. Although Temperley was known to butt heads with Malone, he still spoke many praises of him, saying that his name was never part of mess hall small talk, unless it was talk of hard work, intellectual exercise, and efficiency. As a result of all this, the Wellington Battalion was potentially the most disciplined, steadfast, physically fit, and its officers of much better practical skills and common sense than any other unit on the peninsula. In spite of this fact, that the British soldiers were held up as a pride of the empire and that Anzac troops were inferior. So they were actually, the British soldiers throughout the campaign were really seen as the main bulk of the unit. Like, these are the guys that are going to get the work done. The Anzacs are just the cannon fodder. That image was shattered at Gallipoli, mostly because of that crazy fucker Malone and other men like him. That's to say nothing of his relationship with his wife. He constantly wrote to her, lining up the letters she wrote back by order of date, and would reread them frequently, putting them next to a picture of her. Upon receiving more pictures of her, he wrote, quote, "If I were a stranger, I should fall in love with you at the sight of them. But you know that I am already in love with the bravest and sweetest and loveliest woman in my world," end quote. Even his own men knew that when her letters arrived, it was the highlight of his day. He would often write back about the flowers he found too. Honeysuckle, roses, poppies, daisies, and all sorts of others. Even sending some back to her, while others were found between the pages of his copy of the Field Service Regulations when they were recovered after Chunk Beer. Yeah.
You're doing this to just watch her leak like an
Yeah.
I'm not done.
Just get it over with.
And his love for her wasn't even diminished, even being so far away and facing death every day, though he was concerned that the war would physically age him to the point where it might make their coupling seem weird, because of course, remember, there was already quite an age gap. He even admits that perhaps he had been too distant in the past, putting community affairs above his own. But he does add that he always intended for this to be so he could provide for his family. And he ultimately summed it up in his last letter to Ida, saying that though the choice to go to war was his own, quote, the sacrifice was really yours, end quote. And Malone was such a complex man, one of vision, drive, resourcefulness, dedication, and a deep sense that he should do what he must to protect his family and his country. He always stood up for what he believed in, whether that be his men or his intensity and racism. For what we know, Malone defended Chinook Beer like it was the very soil of New Zealand itself, because he knew what was at stake. The fate of his Wellingtons, who he was fighting shoulder to shoulder with, and the rest of the Anzacs behind him. Despite being an invader 2 times over on someone else's land, I personally think the sheer white-knuckle force of willpower to keep going to defend his men on that ridge and earlier to his superiors is to be commended. Malone and his Wellingtons performed probably one of the most outstanding feats in New Zealand's military history on the ridge of Chinook Beer, and he is probably one of the best military commanders our country has ever seen. It is a cruel irony that potentially one of our own howitzers would take him out. It is at least a small consolation to know that if anyone knew the risks and had made peace with themselves and God, it would have been Malone. Approximately 400 members of the Wellington Battalion remain in Gallipoli, just below the crest of Chinook Beer, never to see home again. One of them is Malone. 16,000 more Anzacs lie elsewhere on the peninsula, in Australia and New Zealand's greatest military disaster, many of them young and ignorant of what they would be facing in this foreign land. A further 28,000 allies and 87,000 Ottomans also remain, totaling 130,000 total deaths for the campaign. To close this episode, I'd like to leave you with a quote from Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was, as we've mentioned, was the Ottoman commander who was chiefly fighting against the Anzacs, which he said after the Gallipoli campaign when our countries were at peace. Quote, those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives are now lying in the soil of a friendly country and are in peace. They have become our sons as well.
Oh my!
Fuck you, Thomas! Oh,
I knew that one would get you.
Oh, it did. Oh,
And that quote is
you just destroyed me, sir. Fuck.
that quote in the Te Papa exhibit that we've talked about numerous times. That is one of the last things that you see as you exit the Gallipoli exhibit. Is that quote? I actually wrote it when I was in there to put into this episode, and right beneath that quote is a little, quite a little unassuming bit of water with quite a lot of pebbles and rocks and things in it. If you actually read the bit that's underneath that quote in that exhibit, those rocks are actually from Anzac Cove in the Gallipoli Peninsula. They were actually brought over for that exhibit specifically. So yeah, that after roughly about 6 episodes is my lecture effectively on the Gallipoli campaign, in particular following Lieutenant Colonel William George Malone and the Wellington Battalion.
Through that particular lens. And just so we all know, I am weeping like a small child. fuck, Thomas, you just destroyed me. You were right.
Yep.
If that's how you were going to wrap it up, you were right. You were going to make me fucking weep, sir. Oh.
Yep.
Oh, let me center myself and get back to what a fucking tale, Thomas. Holy
Thanks.
shit.
What you can find, I was gonna say, for anyone that's like blown to bits about Thomas, you can find and support him. Would you like to share your socials?
Sure.
Patreon?
I can do that. Yeah, you can find me on the the name of my podcast is the History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast, which is, of course, found where you find podcasts and stuff. You can find me on Twitter at History Aotearoa. You can find me on Facebook, History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. Same thing on Instagram, History of Aotearoa New Zealand podcast. Same thing on Patreon as well, if you want to give me money for this kind of stuff. And Aotearoa
fucking deserves it. What a goddamn story. Okay.
You should do Ko-Fi as well.
No, let him spell it. Let him spell it. It's important that he spells it.
Aotearoa, if you don't know how it's spelled, is Aotearoa. But yeah, that's basically me.
Fuck me.
Well, I will at least very quickly say where you can find Jessica, me, and Body Count, because she is wiping.
I am sorry. I'm a weird,
cheeks.
weepy, oh god damn! What a story, Thomas. You nailed it. It's absolutely fantastic, and I cannot tell you thank you enough.
And I want to quickly say, for anyone that enjoyed it, tweet Thomas and tweet us, Body Count Pod, and Jessica B. Manor and Cara DiDemizio. If there was something you really liked about the episode series, please let us know. We love direct feedback, and I'm sure Thomas would be chuffed to bits if you would say, hey, I thought this was interesting about Malone or the campaign or the terrain. Let us know what you found interesting. If this is, what you like, you may want to listen to his podcast as well, given they're not, into the modern context. He's still working his way chronologically throughout New Zealand history. Very gradually. He'll get there. You can also rate and review both Thomas's show, of course, on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser. Same with Body Count Pod. Those 5 stars mean a lot, because for anyone that hasn't heard our spiel before, the nutshell is algorithms determine what gets recommended. So the easiest way to make sure the podcasts you enjoy are getting recommended, if you're not sharing and you're not telling people, is to rate and review. Just say a few words about what you're enjoying, and that makes a huge difference, both to the creators, of course, and for other people that might enjoy our show. So please, if you enjoyed it, let us know, whether it be on Twitter. Thomas has Instagram as well now for the podcast. We're not on it as much, but we promise we will try. And we are on Facebook as well, and that is also a work in progress. So that being said, you can support Body Count Pod on Patreon, of course. We will have more exclusive content very soon for you. Jessica's about finished with the Body Count History Pod website, so that's pretty exciting. We'll have all kinds of recommendations on what we're reading, what rabbit holes we're going down to, what documentaries we're checking out. So stay tuned for that. But seriously, thank you, listeners, for keeping with us, because quite frankly, Thomas, you set the bar so high.
Go give him so much money, y'all.
Throw your dollars
at
Thomas.
I am weeping like a child. It was so good. It was so good. Throw your money at Thomas.
Thank you. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. It's always good to be able to tell these kind of stories, particularly ones that, although Malone's story is quite well known in kind of military circles and that kind of stuff.
It's not to the greater audience, and certainly not the United States.
But also generally just talking about people that were on the ground during the Gallipoli campaign, and just generally in wars and in life in general, there's not a lot of discussion around people that were really doing the hard yards and these sorts of things. So it's always good to be able to talk about and bring more light to people that were really
There
really
and experiencing it.
Yeah, instead of talking about like Hamilton, who spent mostly the whole campaign on a fucking boat, like.
Yeah, and I agree.
Yeah.
I think with military history, there's too much time spent on I guess, strategizing of war
Mm.
and not enough of a mesh between that and the key human integral part of war, especially when we look at World War One or even the immediate predecessors and a lot of the colonial wars, right? There's not enough discussion and nuanced take on boots on the ground, so to
Yeah.
speak. So I really appreciate what you did because I think it will make people think about it, but in a human way.
Yeah,
Which is
and that's hopefully the
more
takeaway.
interesting, in my opinion, because I think one of the struggles for many people with history is the way that it's presented oftentimes in some academia or even just in mandatory schools in the US is dates. You have to know dates, you have to know battles. But that's not the stuff that sticks with you when you grow old. It's not the things that get you. And I think that's why people like a good story, and I think the key is balancing narrative and fact, in my opinion, to keep people entranced. Because if you're presenting it, but you're doing it pedantically, well, that's a shame because you're not you're not engaging and you're not continuing the interest. So that being said, Thomas, real quick, I wanted you to mention some of the resources again. I know you've shared them as you've gone along, but for anyone that's interested, he has done a lot of digging. Several of the museums that are quite convenient to him, actually.
Yeah, I do have
got a
a
lot of
very
access.
large advantage in that regard.
Home field advantage, yeah. But yeah,
sorry,
what were your sources?
The main kind of sources I used, as we've talked a lot about, I went to Te Papa and looked at the Gallipoli exhibit. I've been to that a few times. So if you are local to Wellington or local to New Zealand and you are coming to Wellington for some reason, I highly, highly, highly recommend that. It is, I believe, closing this year. It was originally only set up. Yeah, it was originally only set up for a year. It started on the 25th of April in 2015, and it was only meant to go for a year. And then they extended it to, I believe it was this year. So if you are in New Zealand and you do want to see that exhibit after listening to this, you haven't got long. I think it's only like 4 or 5 more months or something before it closes down. Maybe even less than that. So.
Do you know if they have
quarantine.
do they have virtual open access? Do you know?
I don't believe they do.
You know what, guys? We can find out with a cursory Google search. Thomas has done enough. Let us not put that on him as well.
I can look. Hang on. I will look up specifically when it is being shut down because I feel like that's important.
Bear in mind, we are in a time of quarantine, and New Zealand wants none of our nonsense.
We don't. I mean,
they've done quite well,
understandably.
Oh, sorry. I was slightly incorrect. It finishes on the 25th of April next year in 2022. So you've still got a year to go. But again, if you are in New Zealand and you do want to see that stuff, it is really, really, really good. Weta Workshop have built these huge figures to kind of show you the some scenes from the war. People lying down, people eating food, people a nurse, and this machine gun crew, which is really cool. They've got hair on their arms, and they're wearing fabric uniforms and stuff, and it's really, really good, and the information's really good, and they have these really cool holographic-y type 3D models of the terrain. Then they will talk to you about look, these guys went up here and then they held this position, and these guys went around here, but they had to double back and all this stuff. And it shows you a really good view of things like Quinn's Post and the different hills, and and again gives you a really good appreciation of the kind of terrain that these guys were dealing with, the real topography and the verticality that they had to overcome. So yeah, I really cannot more highly recommend the Te Papa exhibit. It is really, really, really good. I every time I go through, I've been through 5 times now, and I see a different thing. I learn something different every single time. It is just so good. And the other thing they do actually as well is they have this little bunker that you can sit in, and they have someone reading Malone's letters to Ida, or at least some of his letters to Ida. Which is for a lot of for a lot of people. They go in there, they sit down, they go, oh yeah, that's kind of weird, it's kind of interesting, then they leave. It has really no emotional impact, so if you do listen to this, you may have a bit more of emotional impact as to what those letters mean now. So yeah, and there's a lot of stuff about Malone in there as well, specifically, as well as many of his Wellingtons and other various commanders, and as well just various other random people, like medical people, stuff about the donkeys and pack animals that were there, and that sort of stuff. There's a whole lot of other stuff where we have not covered at all in there as well. But the other main book that I used was called Man of Iron by Jock Venel, which is really, really, really good. It basically covers his life from start to finish. So if that's something that if you want to learn more about him and read all the stuff about his political career that I didn't talk about, that's all in there.
There's a lot that Thomas cut that y'all don't even realize. Oh, it's stupid. He cut so much. So
there's a lot of stuff, particularly in his home life, particular anecdotes about where it in places like in Egypt and that sort of stuff I cut out. So there's still a lot, so if you've listened to this and gone, oh well, I don't need that book, there's still a lot in here that I cut. But yeah, so those were kind of the two main sources that I used, along with various others, other smaller ones here and there to kind of take bits. For example, right at the end there, I gave you the total figure of 130,000 deaths. 130,000 deaths at Gallipoli. That number was recently revised in the last couple of years. So I actually got that from a article somewhere else, for example. So there's a few other things I pulled from various other places, like the Torty thing and stuff as well. But yeah, the Man of Iron by Jock Venel and the Te Papa exhibit were kind of the two main sources that I used.
Also, I am so invested in you having to take a pilgrimage to see Torty.
I really want to
let you know, Torty has never been to an Anzac memorial service because Torty is always hibernating for 5 months that coincide with it. I found this out from a 2020 article.
Yeah, April's in our autumn. So yeah, that makes sense.
Can you imagine the shit that turtle's seen? It was literally run over, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
100 years ago, run over.
Yeah, about 100 years ago. Or just over 100 years.
Honestly, between that and the Galapagos Island tortoises, not turtles, that have been around so long, can you imagine the shit? If you could encapsulate what they've witnessed, honestly, it's wild to me. I'm not sure why I'm going to be thinking of Torty before bed, but I will. And if anything happens to Torty before you get to visit Torty, I will be very upset.
I'm gonna be really upset as well.
We're invested
quite
in you
frankly
visiting.
Focused on the haunting, beautiful last quote that Thomas gave to cap this episode.
Aotearoa.
Knowing specifically it was just going to destroy me for at least the next 2 days.
Yeah, it's a really nice quote. And
I can't describe to you the look of pride on his face right now.
I was pretty happy with it.
He has just emotionally destroyed me for multiple days. But yeah, no, it was an excellent choice. And it
Yeah,
was very powerful.
It's a very nice quote, especially when you consider that Ataturk went on to become the effectively the founder of the modern Turkish Republic. So it's really a really kind of poignant quote after the war, considering that he's the leader of the country that or the successor country of the of who we fought against, as well as being the commander at the actual battle itself, which I think lends a lot of kind of weight to that quote as well. It's not just the head of state making a making like some sort of quote for to make it sound nice. He was actually there. Also made questionable decisions, but he was on the front lines doing stuff as well. So he at least was familiar with what was going on. So yeah.
Jeez. I mean, again, we're going to wrap it up, but I cannot tell you, go heap money upon Thomas, because holy shit, what a story you brought us. I am incredibly, and as a person who a lot of times is like, oh, that's impressive, I am incredibly fucking impressed. I am blown away by the work you did for us. What a story. Just for our listeners, these are going to come out all in 1 week, leading up to Anzac Day. So we have a lot of production to do on these, but I think it's going to be incredibly
easiest of
powerful,
productions
and
for
it's just going to
Thomas.
be.
Yeah, I don't have to do anything at this point. I'm done. I'm done after this.
Not only that, but like the fact that like you didn't really need a lot of outtakes. You were just like, come and get it.
That's just the way that I script things. I just had the whole thing written out so I can read it. So yeah, audience, if it sounds like I was reading off a Word doc the entire time, yeah, it's because I was. So.
Oh no, they're quite familiar with that. They're familiar with me. They're very familiar.
You expected me to remember all of that?
Exactly. You expect me to be that good on the fly with bullet points? Fuck off. No, I'm here to tell you a story. Do you want the story or do you not? But you have brought us a story, Thomas. That was unbelievably fantastic from beginning to end. If anything can get me up in the middle of the night to listen to a story, it is definitely you, and it is definitely this particular story. And what a lens you have chosen. It's not a lens a lot of people are going to be familiar with, and I think it's going to blow a lot of people away. It really will. So thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you. This was fantastic.
Thank you for having me on and getting up in the middle of the night, effectively 2 months in a row, to hear me tell this.
Because we're bad at time. It is what it is.
That's a different story.
Different story, but well fucking worth it. Well worth it. And thank you so much on Kara and I's behalf, on our listeners' behalf in advance. Please tweet at Thomas how fantastic this was, because holy shit, what a labor of love. Like, I cannot tell you. It's absolutely, you've blown me away, which is hard to do, Thomas, but you really have. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
That being said, we're going to wrap it up, everybody. You'll be able, again, to hear all of these. You'll know this whole song and dance by the time you finish all of this. Again, this has been a massive labor of love, and it's been a lot of talking, a lot of late nights. But I am so excited that Thomas has brought us all this story, and it's going to be fantastic. So, go out. You're going to be aware of Anzac Day, America, for the first time in your lives, hopefully. Hopefully, by the time you finish listening to this. So thank you, Thomas. We are going to go ahead and wrap it up. Goodbye, everyone.